I'm Jason Raso, and you're watching ForBassPlayersOnly.com.
Hi, and welcome to ForBassPlayersOnly.com. I'm John Liebman, founder and first baseman. You know, a lot of people think they're too old or it's too late for them to learn how to play an instrument. So I created ForBassPlayersOnly.com for adults who want to play bass, because I believe you're never too old and it's never too late to experience the joy and the pleasure of making music. ForBassPlayersOnly.com. Let's play bass. My guest this week is Jason Raso, an old friend from Canada. He is, of course, a bass player. He's also a composer, band leader, author, educator. At last count, he has released 10 albums. It might be more than that by now. I'm not sure, but we'll have to find out. His latest release is called Stringspan, which came out in 2022. And from then to now, that's a long time in Jason Raso's life and career, because he's always got something going on. Jason also worked as a columnist for Canadian Musician magazine, and he's written several books, including Bassline Continuum, Raso's Rollicking Rhythm Reader, and a few other quality publications of interest to bass players and bass enthusiasts. This is his second time on For Bass Players Only. Welcome, Jason. Always great to see you.
Oh, thanks for having me, John. It's great to be here.
My neighbor to the north, up there in Canada.
Yeah, it's cold here today.
Well, you're not going to get a lot of sympathy from me. I saw the weather forecast this morning. Like I said, this is Fahrenheit, of course, but he said it was 4 degrees.
Oh boy. Wow. Yeah. It's
anyway,
chilly.
Yes. Well, now that I've set the tone and bummed us both out here, let's talk about you and what's going on. The last interview we did with you on For Bass Players Only was way back in 2016. And at that time, the then current release was Man of 40 Faces. So that probably feels like forever ago to you, given all the stuff that you've done in the meantime. So bring us up to date on some of the highlights of what you've been up to since then.
Since then, when we put Man of 40 Faces out, that was a fun project. That was more of a solo project, lots of solo pieces and some duets. We did a live album in 2017 with the Funktet, and that was fun because it was we wrote a bunch of new material but recorded it live. So it was a bit nerve-wracking because you hadn't had a chance to play the stuff a lot live, and then here we are making an album in front of people. But it turned out great. That was a fun album to make. And then I got into some book stuff, like you had mentioned. Wrote the Rhythm Reader and some lesson book stuff. So that kind of kept me busy. And then obviously, like everybody else, when COVID hit, there was all of a sudden some time on your hands. So I was at home. So we recorded an album called Return to Planet Bop. That was on the just on Bandcamp. It's available. And then that led into the Stringspan, and Stringspan was more of a collection of collaborations that I had done with players online. So it was a lot of fun. Guys like Stu Hamm, Billy Sheehan, Alain Caron, Rich Brown from Toronto, Paul DeLong, great drummer, and Marito Marquez, another great drummer. So it was a lot of fun to put that together, and that was not really planned to be an album. It was just after a while you start looking at all these pieces you have sitting there and you're like, wow, there's a lot of material here. So maybe it's time to release it. So I was happy with how that project turned out, but it was about a decade in the making without knowing you were making an album,
I don't know if we've ever met in person. I know we've communicated online. Have we?
Oh, never in person.
What?
We've spoken on the phone, but not in person. No.
The reason I mentioned that is because I'm really picking up your Toronto or Metro Toronto accent, your Canadian accent.
Yeah.
But getting back to Stringspan, I've listened to pretty much everything that you've put out. And I've come to the conclusion that you are a big fan of jazz, swing, funk, R&B, rock. I think you might even have a little metalhead in you. Case in point, Stringspan, which features, as you mentioned, Stu Hamm, Billy Sheehan, Alain Caron. Uh, that's a pretty good cross section of bass styles, wouldn't you say?
Oh yeah. You know, it's funny. I grew up on hard rock. Like when I was growing up, it was all Van Halen, and we learned a lot of Zeppelin, a lot of Black Sabbath. You know, got into some even heavier stuff like Metallica and Pantera, and so we were playing a lot of that. But Rush for sure, especially being from this area. Um, so yeah, obviously I gravitated towards bands where the bass player was a little more active. First concert I ever went to was Joe Satriani at Massey Hall, and Stu was on bass. So right away I was into that. I was a diehard Billy Sheehan fan growing up. So getting to record with Billy was a dream come true for sure. Um, but as I grew as a player, you started hearing all kinds of other stuff. My dad always loved Motown and R&B, so I was hearing that at home. My mom loved Queen and Prince and Elton John. So
Queen and Prince.
yeah, my mom was cool. She loved everything. She was all over the place.
No, I was
Uh,
just, you said Queen and then you said Prince, and I just,
yeah, yes, very very royal. It was a regal household. Um, so yeah, it was and then I when bass player magazines started showing up, I was reading about Jocko, and I was reading about Marcus Miller, and upright players, Charles Mingus, Paul Chambers, and before you know it, as you know, you're in the rabbit hole, and you might as well just settle in because you're not getting out of the rabbit hole.
well, and then another thing that you made me think of, both my wife and my mother are from Canada.
No,
And
well,
it seems to me, wasn't there a law on the radio stations that it was something crazy, like 1 out of 5 records that they played on the radio had to be from a Canadian artist? So you mentioned
yeah,
Rush, but you probably heard a lot of, I don't know, Anne Murray and Joni
yeah, we
Mitchell,
heard, yeah,
Gordon
Joni Mitchell,
Lightfoot.
yeah, lots of Gordon Lightfoot, lots of Brian Adams, lots of Celine
Guess
Dion.
who? BTO.
Yeah, yes, yeah, absolutely. Um, and you mentioned Alain Caron before, so Uzeb. I heard a lot of Uzeb when I was a kid, and those were the first bands that were like those fusiony type bands. Chick Corea Electric Band. Patitucci was a big guy for me because they were kind of still had some of that hard rock element, so I could kind of understand some of it. But then, when you sat down to try to figure out some of the bass parts, I was like, I have no idea what's going on here. so I better get to work, buy some John Liebman books, and learn what I'm doing.
And that's why you're the success that you are. Well, thanks, Jason. Good talking.
Exactly. We've covered it. Yeah. But all kidding aside, those books were huge for me, especially the funk bass book and the funk fusion bass book. Taught me a lot about reading rhythms, and so they were huge for me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Want to talk about some of your own bass education resources, but I want to pick up on something you said before. You reminded me, one of the interviews I did with Brian Beller, he
Oh
was
yeah.
talking about, you were talking about, you recorded the album live, and it was still all kind of new, and that's pretty much what a band puts out a new record, and then people go to the concert, and they say, well, now we'd like to do something from our new record, and everybody goes boo. But the point he was making was, they did the album, they released it, then they did a tour, and he said, I kind of wish that we had done the tour and then recorded the
Oh
album,
yeah.
because we had played it so many times and we solidified so many things. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Did you feel any of that with your project?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Now we were lucky. A few of the tunes we had played for a little bit leading up to the recording. So, but we had some additional members. So it was normally at that time we were a 4-piece band, but this recording was a 6-piece. And so yeah, you always wish you had more time to develop the material, but I think it was also different for the audience because they knew coming in that we're making an album, and so it was kind of a different vibe for the show as well. So we did 2 nights and recorded the tunes, and the crowd was great, and so it was fun. But yeah, you always wish you had more time to play the material before you record it. But
yeah, well, I guess maybe you could play the material in some clubs or something and just get
yeah, for sure,
time with it. You reminded me of something else. When I was in high school, Bob Seger was. I grew up in the Detroit area where we were the only ones that knew about Bob Seger before the whole rest of the world knew about him. So he was a local guy, a very prominent local guy. But that album that he did, Live Bullet, back in the 70s when I was in high school. And there's a part on that album. He says, all right, people, we got the 16-track tape machines rolling out back. So if you sing with me now, I can't guarantee it, but you just might get on an album. Well, that was a big deal. Everybody screamed, but I'm thinking 16-track. Hey, that's a
lot of tracks.
Yeah. I'm sure it was 2-inch tape that Well,
I love those live albums.
How we do everything on these things. So
yeah, the live albums from that era, I love them.
Brampton Comes Alive,
Brampton Comes Alive, Kiss Alive, all that stuff was fun to listen to. There's like a Aerosmith one called Live Bootleg or something like that. That's always a fun listen.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, you're always working on something. And in our email exchange leading up to this interview, you mentioned something. So why don't I just let you tell me and the folks what's percolating right now?
Yeah, right now I'm in the middle of recording a new album. It's a album of Beatles arrangements. I started this project about 6 years ago, and then I chickened out. So I don't know, so some of the pieces are solos, and I got into this kind of headspace, which I talked about a little bit in the Bassline Continuum book, where it's pretty easy to be hard on yourself. So when I was in the middle of recording these pieces, I don't know what you're like, but when I hear myself in a band context, I can look past my performance a little bit for the good of the tune. If the drum track's killer and everything sounds great and my bass parts, I'm not sure if it sounds good in the mix, I'm happy. But when you're listening to yourself solo, it just becomes so, no, I don't like that. Everything's bad. So I had to shelve it. But this year I thought, when I've got these arrangements, I'd like to finally finish them. And I thought what I would do this time is hire a producer to kind of take the solo pieces and just say, yeah, this one's cool. So right now I'm in the middle of just recording a bunch of takes, and then I'll hand them over and try to disassociate myself from the process, right? Because otherwise I'm worried I'll end up back in the same, nothing's good enough.
I know. If the feel comes through, if one of the notes is, hey, you want to feel better, listen to a Miles Davis record, say if you make a mistake, do it again and again and again, so people think you did it on purpose. It's part of it.
Exactly. Yeah, so it's but I struggle with that for sure. So it's but so far so good. The project's going well, and hoping to complete it in a month or so.
Oh, excellent. There's a couple of things that you make me think of. Well, one of them, I've spoken to, I've asked Chuck Rainey about this. I've asked Leland Sklar about this. It's a good thing I didn't really know about this. It helped me a lot not knowing about it. I said, what if the take itself, the track with the whole band sounds good, But if you isolate some of the individual parts, there's some questionable stuff. And they say, "Oh, are you kidding? It happens all the time." And they'll say, "Well, you can redo it if you want, but I don't think you have to." So I've recorded a lot of stuff for my books and for my
Yeah.
online resources. Well, I didn't. I don't want to say I didn't fall back on that, but actually, you know what? Now that I think of it, on some of the early recordings from my books, the bass is isolated, so it is, it was like naked. That's
Ah,
and it just forced me to just focus on playing. So even if I'm playing with the band, everything's got to be clean, the attacks, the
yeah.
releases, all of those things. So being dumb like that and not knowing actually helped my, my bass playing. So
Oh,
thank
for sure. Yeah. That makes sense.
Tell me a little more about the Beatles record, the arrangements. What you said, some of it is solo. Do you mean unaccompanied bass?
Yeah, yeah. So some of them are straight up solo pieces, and that's how the project started. I always liked pieces like that. As much as I love being in a band, it's fun sometimes to just play a piece of music on bass that sounds like a complete arrangement. So I started with tunes like "Here Comes the Sun" and "Yesterday," and eventually I had 7 or 8 of those, and thought, yeah, it's time to record them.
What are you doing?
Um,
Like 5 string, 6 string, where you go up high and get the or
you
four
know
string?
what? It's all 4 string, and it's all within like the range of like a 21 fret jazz bass, and nothing's tuned down or. So that was also part of it, was just having some pieces that also I could give to students and say, okay, here's a piece of a song that but arranged so you have to learn the melody, and so some of them I arranged with students, and it was a good project for that. And yeah, not extended range, and a bunch of stuff like that. And then some ended up being duets. So we'll have a few guests on the album. And
Anybody any names you
I,
can?
I don't want to jinx it, so
Okay, okay.
that news will be coming soon.
Fair. I was watching somebody online, Brad Russell, I don't remember who it was, playing a bunch of Paul McCartney bass lines, and he
Yeah.
said some of these bass lines are just songs all unto themselves.
Oh yeah. Yes. And some of the arrangements that I tried, a lot of them didn't work because the bass line was so, you know, integral to the tune that when you took it away to learn the melody and try to stack the parts on top of each other, it just didn't work. So a few of those ended up being uh, arranged as duets. And so yeah, it's such a fascinating body of work to dig into and see what's happening, and you learn a lot about melody, that's for sure.
Uh, Oh, I think it's just incredible. I think he's just magic because he's got such an uncanny ability to know exactly what a song needs. And
Yeah.
the song "Something." I can't remember. I was interviewing somebody, and he says, "How could he play such a busy bass line that doesn't get in the way?" It's incredible.
Yeah, for sure. And I think he's a player I always recommend students listen to because uh, you know he doesn't play conventional lines. Like there's times where you're like, yeah, exactly what you said. How and why did you make that choice? And how is it awesome? Like, how did you get away with that one? And so it's always good because I think a lot of times we tend to lay back a lot, which quite often is the good thing to do.
Yeah.
But there's times where you're like, McCartney is not laying back, and he's playing super melodic lines, and the influence he had on other players, I think, is important. Like I love Dee Murray from
Oh,
Elton John's
oh,
band. Man, so you can hear the McCartney influence, but he took it in some different directions. John Deacon from Queen, I think, is another guy who's super melodic. If you listen to that bass line on "You're My Best Friend," oh man, that that line is so good. And he's way up there playing like almost a melody in that pre-chorus. It's beautiful. So I think you can you can push it. I think it's good to have a good sense of when to go for it and when to lay back. But I think that just happens with time and experience
Yeah.
and a lot of listening.
Yeah, and being sensitive and having a certain amount of musical maturity and
Absolutely, yeah.
giving the song what it needs, not
But knowing when to be immature too. We talk a lot about that, like, right? We talk a lot about being mature as a player, but sometimes you got to go the other way.
Hey, I knew I liked you, Jason.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to talk about teaching bass and
Yeah.
some of your approach to teaching bass. I know you're also an educator. For Bass Players Only is a bass instruction site. And
Yes.
most of the students that I've attracted over time have been not who I thought they were going to be. I thought I was going to get the 20-year-olds and the kids in college, but most of the people I've attracted turned out to be mostly men in their 50s, 60s, 70s. I've got a few students in their 80s. And we're
Awesome.
getting more women now too, but it's mostly those people. And they're not trying to be rock stars. They're not looking for a career in music. They want to play bass. They've got perhaps more time than they used to have, just with
Right.
college and a job and a family and a mortgage, all that stuff. And now they've got some
Yeah.
more time. Also, things that happen to a lot of us when we get past 50s, 60s, 70s, up in the senior years, uh, things like arthritis and tendonitis and those kinds of things kind of creep in.
Yeah.
And one of the things I try to impress on my students is you don't have to be Billy Sheehan or Stu Hamm or John Entwistle. It's amazing, or Paul McCartney. It's amazing how good you can make the music feel with just a super simple bass line. You can still play that song and capture that essence, that feeling, but you don't have to be a contortionist or any of that. So I'm just trying to set a context here, but I really want to hear your advice, what you could impart to somebody like that who wants to learn to play bass. Most of them just want to play some classic rock riffs with their buddies or some blues
Yeah.
shuffles or maybe some walking bass. So within that context, what advice can you impart to somebody like that who wants to learn bass? What should they be thinking about?
Yeah, I think you're dead on. Like, one thing that I'll do with lines that are a little busier, I'll get the students to kind of try to strip that line down to like what is actually making the line, you know, and quite often it's real simple. It might not be, if it's a big run of 16ths, you can pull out a few eighth notes, and all of a sudden you're like, well, actually, that sounds as good as what you're hearing. So yeah, shuffles, really big on walking for any style, because that's how you're going to build uh, movement from chord to chord, right? So a lot of the
All
students,
did,
especially,
all did a lot of that. All
yeah,
my
absolutely, yeah, it's
line.
all over. 8 days a week.
Yep.
Even when you listen to his busier lines, like something like "Lovely Rita," it's a walking bass line. He's walking from chord to chord. He puts it in an eighth note context a lot of times, but you start listening and you're like, oh yeah, he's just walking through the scale, getting from chord to chord. So you can really um, hear a lot of cool movement in his bass lines. So learning walking, and you're right, it doesn't have to be, you're not blistering through these patterns a lot of times, but it really works. So yeah, I like that. A lot of the rock players that I teach, when we start to get into walking, you can see they're like, oh no, I don't want to play jazz. You know, you're like, well, walking is not just for jazz. It's like it's all over pop music. A lot of what Jamerson did, I think, is based on walking. Like when you look at his lines, he changes the rhythm of it, but how if you just straighten out his line, you usually can see, oh, he went root, fifth, third, chromatic. You can see a walk, even though he's changed the rhythm. I do an exercise with the students that I call walk, run, dance. So it's like we'll write a walking line, straight up quarter notes, and then we'll, displace one of the quarter notes by an eighth note, and it turns into like almost like an R&B groove. Then we'll double some of those up and turn them into like more of a syncopated 16th note kind of thing, and all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, I can see how that walk turned into this. So that's a really, in terms of advice, that seems to work the best for a lot of my students, and it's worked well for me. So
Sure, you worked some anticipation in that too, playing the
absolutely, yeah. Like I said, you look at a line like Bernadette, and you can see those little walking figures, and yeah, it's Jamerson's awesome. He's a good one to study too.
Yeah, and he's got the jazz roots, definitely.
Yeah.
You know what I think about sometimes, just to put things in perspective, when I was, I don't know, 17 or, give or take, and I was really getting it, it was Stanley Clark and it was, Jocko, I guess. I don't know if Jocko was very prominent when I was 17, but what I think about now is I was not asking the right questions. I did not have the right goals. I was shedding, not when I was a little older, Paganini, Perpetual Moto Perpetual, and Flight of the Bumblebee, and the fusion stuff, and I had an exchange with Jeff Berlin this morning. I remember sitting on the floor in my apartment when I was, I don't know, 23 or something, transcribing Joe Frazier. But that's cool if you want to do that and play that, but that shouldn't be the goal of being a bass player. What questions do you think a bass player should be asking? Like what can I learn to be a good bass player? And it's not trying to go, that's fun and that's cool, but that's not what people want. What do you think they should be asking?
Yeah, I'm always torn on that, right? Because I think for me, when I started, obviously it was guys like Stu and Billy, but both of those guys can lay it down. Like they're both solid bass players. So I think what you should be asking is, when you're studying a player like that, looking at all sides of the playing. Not just when he's ripping it up, but when he's playing on the ballad. Hey, what's he doing on that one? I wish I paid more attention to that. It's funny too. I remember I never took lessons, so I learned how to play through Bass Player magazine. That was my teacher, which was really good in some ways, and it was a disaster in other ways, because I didn't. Structure only showed up after a few years after you could piece a bunch of columns together. You know what I mean? Like, otherwise it was just month to month, like whatever was in the magazine this month was what I was learning. And I always thought, I always felt like the players in the interviews were lying to me. Like that there was they weren't giving me the real thing they're working on. But it turns out they were, so I wish I was a little bit more in depth with what I was reading, when a player said, oh, I'm working on simple quarter notes, or I'm working on, walking bass lines. And I think, that can't be right, because he sounds crazy. He's doing all this other stuff. But a lot of those players were telling you exactly what they were doing and laid it all out for you. But I didn't catch it the first time around. So it's funny when I go back to read an old article now, I'm like, oh, he did tell me to do that. I wish I listened more.
I remember Jeff Berlin had a column back.
Jeff Berlin's column was great. Dave LaRue had a column.
Yeah.
And Dave's column was great. Will Lee had a column. Chuck Rainey wrote a lot of columns back in the day for them.
Patitucci did some stuff too.
Patitucci had one, a monthly one. I learned a lot from that. But like I said, because it was being dished out once a month, it wasn't always a clear structure. So you'd have to go back and So it took a long time to, but you know,
I
it worked.
remember before Bass Player magazine, I used to read Guitar Player magazine.
Yeah, yeah.
Tommy
If you were
Tedeschi.
lucky, every now and then they throw a little bass column in there.
No, there was a regular monthly
Was
page.
there one?
Herb Mickman,
Oh yeah.
and I got to know him. He was a very good piano player, also.
Oh,
And
that's cool.
we're going over to his place in LA, and we were jamming, and I'd play bass, and he'd play piano, and then we'd both play bass. I didn't play piano, but
Yeah. There
yeah.
were, the guitar magazines. Yes, Randy Coven wrote a column
Oh
for.
yeah. You
Uh,
mentioned him in the other interview. Sammy says, "Ouch."
I love Randy. Randy was awesome.
Gone too
He,
soon.
he was over the top, but but in an awesome way. Uh, yeah, I love Randy. Um, yeah, he wrote one for, I think, Guitar for the Practicing Musician. I think he was a columnist in that for a while, and so yeah, I pieced a lot of it together through that. But yeah, in terms of questions, I wish I, not so much questions, but I wish I paid more attention to all of the things they were telling me, not just the stuff about the flash and the
Yeah.
technique. Like I said, in almost all of those interviews, they were laying out what they were practicing, triads and walking and rhythm exercises, and even the flashiest guys were telling you that, but I wasn't always listening. So
Yeah. Well, I think those things are great, but I think what you have to have in the back of your mind is to what end? Oh, I'm going to blow them away. Wait till they get a load of me. No, that's
yeah, yeah,
it's like you didn't use these words, but when you're talking about Billy Sheehan or Stu Hamm, what I got out of that was taking care of business. That's the important part. You mentioned the ballad and when they're not
yeah,
doing lazy stuff, taking care of
yeah, absolutely. And all those players could do that. Like
that's I talk about that a lot. Victor Wooten.
Victor. Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, I think those players get a bad rap sometimes. But like Stanley grooves his ass off. Like, like when you listen to him on those George Duke albums, and man, that guy can lay it down. So I think sometimes we look at those players and go, "Oh wow, they're just the flash guys." But you're like, no, they can lay it down. Like when they need to. But then when it's time to go, they can go. I was really drawn to those players because Marcus Miller's uh, maybe the best example of that. Like, I mean, he can solo and he can play whatever he wants, but there's no groove problems with Marcus Miller.
Almost on the other end of the spectrum, if that's a good way of putting it, Lee Sklar. He's not known for his pyrotechnics or his flashiness.
Yeah.
That he's known.
Beautiful lines and the grooves bulletproof. Yeah, I mean, it's those are what those players have in common, right? I wish I paid more attention to that early on, but I got lucky because as I moved into R&B and started to learn Jamerson lines, Chuck Rainey, Willie Weeks, you learned a lot of that through there. And then for me, the hard part was like, how am I going to mesh this together so that it's not just, a big show off fest. I try to find a nice balance of, of, like you said, taking care of business. And then when it's time to solo, one of the biggest impacts on my playing was seeing Marcus Miller at a clinic, and a guy gets up and asks a question. He says, I'm struggling. What should I be working on? Should I be working on my groove or should I be working on my soloing? And Marcus said to him, who said you get to choose? Like he said, we would never ask a piano player if they could solo and play chords and comp. He said, so if you're a bass player and you want to be a complete musician, you better be able to do both. And I was like, okay, it was like he threw down the gauntlet, and I was like, all right, if that's what Marcus wants me to do, then I'm going to go home and I'm going to get to work. So I love that idea of I want to be able to do both well, and and the opportunity will arise for me to do both. And if I don't get to solo for a whole set or a whole night, that's cool. But when there's time to solo, I want to be ready to go for it.
Keep it in your back pocket, pull it out if and when you need it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. What are some of your other bass resources that you've written, that you've developed? What would
I've
you?
written a couple books for Mel Bay, soloing on electric bass and improvising on electric bass, and they're
You
really
put a big disclaimer on.
Oh no, I probably should. But,
Not responsible for you getting fired.
exactly, and yeah, they're more chord tone focused, so really trying to get players to kind of get their triads together. So whether you're building bass lines or playing a melody or taking a solo, that you're aware of what's in the chord and all that stuff. So they were fun to write. And then the rhythm reader is really designed to be learn how to read rhythms, straight up from whole notes all the way to sixteenths. And again, a lot of this stuff was written as exercises for students, and then after a while you have hundreds of these exercises sitting there because you're writing them every day. And then it was after a while, it just felt like it was a good time to compile them and get them out. So most of my books have come from that.
What about the Bass Continuum project?
That one was an interview book, and a lot of that was kind of due to my struggles with kind of beating myself up over my playing. So one question I started to ask people during interviews was, how do you deal with that? And I thought, I wondered if I was the only player going through this, and it turns out everybody is going through it. So it was fun. You're in the book, which was great. We did an interview at that time. So that was a blast. But, players like Billy and Stu and John Patitucci's in the book, Steve Swallow, even Derek Smalls from Spinal Tap.
Yes, I saw that. I his name, you said, seriously.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was hilarious. But yeah, I think a lot of players, Jerry Jamont was in the book, and it was just Rufus Reed, a real good cross section of players. And everyone had similar stories about, like, you have to be kind to yourself. It's a process, and obviously everyone wants to play and sound great, but you can get away from the goal sometimes and not feel so good about yourself. So it was nice to talk to all those players, because obviously I grew up idolizing these great players, but it was nice to know that they also kind of had moments where they felt like it wasn't good enough, and so it was fun. It was a comforting experience for sure.
Would you say that was your biggest takeaway from compiling that book?
Oh yeah, it was, and just how nice everybody is. Just the fact that they took time to talk to to me, some guy in Guelph. They're all generous with their time, and
I know that blows me. I've done so many interviews, and Lee Sklar doesn't need me. Abe Laboriel doesn't need me. Paul McCartney, well, maybe Paul needs me. I gave his career.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's true. You feel like, it means a lot to talk to those players. Like I said, like I grew up, like for me, like my first bass hero was Billy, and he's just super nice. Like,
well, what's fun about doing interviews is, sometimes you get the impression that they may not be into it at the beginning, and then after a few minutes that they loosen up, and people like to talk about themselves.
Yeah, I think people like talking about the instrument. They like talking about what they listened to and how they learned. And somebody like John, my daughter was playing bass at the time. She's moved more to piano, but
Ella.
Stella, yep. And we went. So he arranged for us to go to see Chick Corea and in Michigan, and we got to meet John, and he was great with Stella, and he didn't have to do that. It's I really appreciate anytime I get to talk to a player that I admire, and it's I never lose sight of that it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, yeah. People are great. Out of all the bass players and guitar players and everybody I've interviewed, look, over 1,000, there was only one person that I just didn't like, and I'm not gonna disclose the
Yeah,
name.
yeah, but that's crazy. Like that's if that's one out of thousands, that's yeah. I've yet to meet anybody like in the interview process or anybody that was not nice.
Yeah,
Everyone went out of their way to help you, and
they
I
say
really
don't meet your heroes. You know what? I remember meeting a sports guy that I idolized when I was 8 years old, and I just kind of wish I hadn't. But
yeah,
Larry Coryell was a great guy to talk to, and Chuck Rainey and Lee Sklar, and all these people. They're
yeah.
just a lot nicer than they have to be.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. I think when you're talking to somebody and you have that common ground where you're like, oh, we're listening to this, and have you heard this, I think everyone wants to share that information. Like, oh, this is what I was listening to, and I remember talking to Rufus Reed, and he just rifled off a bunch of bass players for me to check out, and then it's fun. You go check out a bunch of players, and you like I said, when you're in that rabbit hole, you're just in there. You
Yeah.
live there.
So the Beatles album is going to be out
uh,
February or March, say, of 2024.
it probably will take a while to get it out, but the recording process should be done in the next month or so.
Okay.
Uh,
So
so
sometime in 2024, we can look
yeah,
forward.
I'm hoping late. It'll probably be later in the year.
Oh, okay.
Just by the time you get all the artwork done and the
Sure.
mixing and
Do you have a title for the record?
not yet, not yet. I'm hoping that will just jump out. But I've been posting some of the progress on Instagram and it's just Beatles for Bass right now, and so people can follow along there if they want to check it out. And like I said, fingers crossed, we'll have some some great guests lined up, and it's been a fun project.
Keep
And
me posted on the progress. Hey, I think just to be totally authentic, you should play everything lefty.
the funny part is I am left-handed. but when I started playing bass, we went downtown Guelph, and this is in 1988 or 87, and I walk in there with my dad. My dad's old school Italian, and he says to the guy, "My son wants to play bass. What do you got?" And he says, "Oh, our basses are over here." And my dad goes, "He's left-handed." And the guy just laughed. He's like, "Oh, I don't have any lefties." And I always joke with my dad. I said, the sales guy said the two words no old school Italian man wants to hear: special order.
Oh,
Because that means more money. So my dad was like, "You know what? Just play right." Like, it's weird at first anyway. So, and I'm glad he did, because there's obviously still way more righty options, although it's gotten a lot better. But so yeah, I learned how to play right-handed.
if we ever have dinner together, I'll be mindful of which side of you.
That's right. That's a big conversation at family dinners. Yes,
Yeah, my son is a lefty. So, John Patitucci is a lefty. Did you know that?
I did know that. Yeah, yeah.
I
That's a,
just found out a couple of years ago, but he plays righty. But then you get not just the guys that turn it over, but then you get Jimmy Haslip, and there's a couple
oh,
of guys that do.
yeah.
I don't know how he does that without restringing it, and especially when he does some slapping. Oh, how can you slap and pop? And anyway, he
I
does.
can't wrap my head around it. He's one guy when I watch him, I have no idea what's happening.
Sounds good though.
Oh, he sounds incredible. Yeah.
Well, Jason, it is so great catching up with you. Let's not wait another 8 years or whatever before we do it again. And I will wave to you when I drive past Guelph on my way to and from Toronto, or maybe we
That's
should.
awesome.
When my wife and I had met and started in a relationship, I was in the Detroit area. She was in Toronto. We used to
Oh,
meet
okay.
in London for dinner. We did that a couple of
Oh,
times.
yeah. I got some family in London. Yeah.
Yeah. There used to be an Olive Garden on Wellington Road in London. That's what we met a couple of times, and I said, "This is too hard. I'm just going to marry her." So,
Exactly. Right at the Olive Garden. Yeah.
26 plus years and going strong. Well, thanks,
Well,
Jason. Jason, it was great. We will watch for the
thank you.
Beatles project, whatever it's called. I'm sure it's going to be great, as is all your other stuff. So
Thank you
keep
so much.
going, and we will continue to enjoy all the great stuff you put out.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're watching for BassPlayersOnly.com. I'm John Liebman, founder and first baseman. You know, a lot of people think they're too old or it's too late for them to learn how to play an instrument. So I created ForBassPlayersOnly.com for adults who want to play bass, because I believe you're never too old and it's never too late to experience the joy and the pleasure of making music. For BassPlayersOnly.com, this is the place to learn bass. Thanks again to my special guest, Jason Raso. I will see you all right here next week, same time, same place. In the meantime, let's play bass.